I'm Michael Lippin, and this is Voice of America's VOA China 360, a weekly podcast looking at how China influences the rest of the world and how China is influenced by the world, including America. In this edition, the U.S. government provides its first official reactions to Hong Kong's September 4th Legislative Council election. It was an election that saw a record number and percentage of registered Hong Kong voters turn out to fill the 70 seats in the Autonomous Chinese Territories legislature known as LegCo. It also saw Hong Kong's opposition camp that wants faster democratization grow its share of LegCo seats from 27 to 30, reducing the pro-establishment and pro-Beijing camp from 43 seats to 40. But the opposition pan-democratic camp also became more fractured. Several veteran and moderate pro-democracy lawmakers retired from LegCo or lost their seats. Taking their place were half a dozen younger activists known as Localists, who want to prevent Hong Kong's identity from being eroded by Beijing and by a growing influx of mainland Chinese. Some Localists have called for a more radical type of democratic reform, a change to Hong Kong's constitution or basic law that would allow Hong Kongers to have self-determination. As in, they want Hong Kong to be able to decide whether or not to declare independence from Chinese rule when a 50-year period of autonomy following its handover from Britain expires in 2047. With this month's election, Localists advocating those views will have multiple seats in LegCo for the first time. And what does the Obama administration think about that result? The State Department's East Asia and Pacific Bureau spokeswoman Anna Ritchie-Riley sent VOA a brief statement that made no mention of the Localists or of any other political groups in Hong Kong. She said, "The turnout of voters in Hong Kong was an affirmation of the commitment of the people of Hong Kong to participate in the democratic process." Ritchie-Riley also said, "We look forward to working with all elected leaders to build strong relations between the United States and Hong Kong and to achieve mutually beneficial goals." I also got a statement from U.S. Congressman Chris Smith, who chairs the Hong Kong caucus in the House of Representatives. Smith said the election was a referendum on what he called Beijing's rough oversight of Hong Kong, and expressed hope that Chinese President Xi Jinping will change course. Xi's government issued a 2014 ruling that Hong Kong people can only elect their leader directly for the first time if the leadership candidates are vetted by a pro-Beijing committee. That angered Hong Kong's opposition camp, sparking a 2-month street protest in 2014 known as Occupy Central, and eventually leading opposition lawmakers to veto reforms based on Beijing's decree. Congressman Smith expressed concern that in this month's election, some opposition candidates withdrew under pressure, while others were disqualified for explicitly backing independence. Besides U.S. officials monitoring Hong Kong's progress, there's little indication of what Americans will do or say specifically about the new Localist lawmakers.
Americans, while they are supportive, I think, of these young politicians who are elected to LegCo, need to remember that Hong Kong, while a very special place, is 100% a city of the People's Republic of China, full stop.
Robert Daly is the director of the Washington-based research group the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. He tells me that the U.S. should be careful not to express too much support for a political movement in a Chinese city where Beijing has ultimate control.
So America, I think, needs to see these LegCo elections and Hong Kong politics generally as a subset of Chinese politics, and to see them primarily as an observer and not as a participant.
I asked Daly to elaborate on why he thinks the U.S. should not engage in any special advocacy for Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement.
The answer, which may sound cold, is that I think we should respond to it as we would respond to similar demands or interests from, say, young activists in Changsha, Hunan province, or Nanchang. These are Chinese people under, ultimately, the leadership of the Communist Party, whether we like it or not. And obviously the United States very much wants Hong Kong to retain its many civic freedoms, its relative freedoms of speech. But we also want those things in general for all Chinese people. It would be extremely destabilizing, destructive, I think, not only to U.S.-China relations, but also destructive to the cause of greater autonomy in Hong Kong, for the United States to weigh in with a heavy hand as though it could influence Beijing and as though it had a direct interest in the outcomes. I think that would be a mistake.
Daly also questions the U.S. government's history of keeping its economic and cultural relations with Hong Kong separate to those with mainland China.
For some purposes, for accounting things like trade volumes, we treat Hong Kong as a separate entity. I see no justification for that. It is part of the People's Republic of China. Its trade volumes, whatever else should be a part of what we see as the Chinese trade volumes. There is no reason that I know of other than a kind of nostalgia that borders on blinkered romanticism to treat it as though it is in fact a separate sovereign entity. We have to think very, very carefully about this. We do not have an interest in telling the people of Hong Kong that we don't care about their rights guaranteed to them under one country, two systems. But we don't really hold any cards other than moral suasion, which is the card that we hold against China in a number of other spheres, and that frankly doesn't work very well.
Richard Bush, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, has a somewhat different perspective to Daly.
If somehow Beijing in the next 30 years were to decide that the localists are right and that Hong Kong people should, at some point before 2047, be allowed to have an exercise of self-determination, and if they decided to set up a separate country, the United States is not going to object to that, but it accepted as a reality and still accepts as a reality that Hong Kong is a part of China. I suspect that the United States would say that the most productive thing to do at this point is work towards improving the political system that exists in Hong Kong now under the Basic Law, and that China has a responsibility for that, Hong Kong government has a responsibility, political parties in Hong Kong have a responsibility for that, and focus on what is possible and how to get there.
I wanted to know what Bush thinks of Daly's argument that Washington should not go out of its way to promote democracy in Hong Kong as opposed to other parts of China.
I certainly agree with his basic premise that we should be advocating for greater political freedom and popular choice for all the people of China. But Hong Kong is at a different point in its political and social development, and that allows a different policy position. Moreover, China itself, in the Basic Law, granted the people of Hong Kong the civil and political rights that are present in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, including freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. It granted the rule of law through an independent judiciary. All of those are precious assets for Hong Kong, and we, the United States, should oppose backsliding and a retrogression from what Hong Kong already has. Now, the rhetorical position also of the United States is that the leadership of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government is going to be more legitimate if that leadership is picked through competitive democratic elections that reflect the will of the people. And that's why the electoral reform process that occurred between 2013 and 2015 was so important. And it's too bad that that process failed. Finally, I'm sure that Robert didn't mean this, but there are some aspects of the Hong Kong system that are different from the PRC system that are actually very important for the United States, and where the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act dictates that our relationship with Hong Kong will be a function of how well Hong Kong maintains that differential. The capacity of Hong Kong customs is one example. We provide to Hong Kong more favorable treatment for the transfer of technology than we do to China, and you can imagine why that is. If we were to find that Hong Kong customs were allowing the leakage of technology intended for Hong Kong entities into the rest of China, then we would change our relationship with Hong Kong, and we would have to put it on a par with other Chinese cities for purposes of that policy issue.
Bush says there are additional reasons for the U.S. to give Hong Kong special treatment.
We have a lot of commercial interest in Hong Kong. We have a lot of citizens and permanent residents of Hong Kong origin, and they play an active role in American life, and they care what goes on in the place of their birth and the place of their rearing. I think also Hong Kong is important as a testbed for certain ideas about how politics can be organized. The fact that the rule of law and certain civil and political rights can be accommodated in a modernized Chinese urban society should give the leaders in Beijing more confidence that those same kinds of arrangements could work in China itself. Experimenting with elections in Hong Kong and getting the bugs out of the system could be very useful in preparing China for the day, which I hope will come someday, where they pick more leaders by genuine competitive elections.
How do you think the U.S. should respond to the rise of political voices in Hong Kong seeking self-determination? You can share your thoughts on Twitter at VOA China 360 and on my Facebook profile, michael.lippin, as well as on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/VOA-English. You can also subscribe to this podcast on iTunes. Just search for VOA China 360. That's it for me for this week. Bye for now.